My focus here is going to be on the client side of AJAX using jQuery. But by its nature, AJAX on the client has to communicate with something on the server. And that something on the server has to be able to communicate with and respond to requests from the client. The nice thing about jQuery is that it's able to communicate with any web server that supports HTTP and common web protocols. So you're not going to be tied to any particular server technology. All of the sample pages that I'm going to be showing you are HTML pages, as opposed to using a server-side page technology like ASP.NET's web forms or MVC pages. But the server component that I'm going to use to respond to AJAX requests is implemented as an ASP.NET web service. This is mostly for convenience, but you could easily implement the same web services in any other web server technology, and the samples would work just fine. So let's take a look at the web services that I'm going to be using throughout this part of the course. Here's the AJAX project that has all of the sample code that I'm going to be showing you to demonstrate jQuery's AJAX functionality. I'll come over here to Solution Explorer, and as you can see, I have this AJAX services. And I'll double-click on that to open up the code file. Now once again, this is using ASP.NET Web Services. This part of the course is not about the server side of AJAX, but I could just as easily could have used a WCF, a Windows Communication Foundation service, or something in the Java or Apache worlds as well. So it's simply a matter of convenience to use an ASP.NET Web Service. This AJAX services.asmx.cs file is in the same root folder as all of the HTML pages, which makes it very easy to reference the web service in the client code. And I'll show you how you do that when I start looking at the client pages. But this file implements several different web services, returning different kinds of data to the client so I can show off different features of AJAX in jQuery. All right, so I have a web service with a namespace using this is a URI. This is not an actual URL that you can navigate to. It just identifies the web service. And it's using some various binding and so forth, a component model. And I'm going to be using the code from client-side script. So I need to include this script service attribute as well. If I don't include this, then the web service is not going to be able to communicate with the client-side services. All right. The first one is the almost requisite Hello World web service. This simply returns a string consisting of Hello World, almost a cliché, and an integer that increments each time the page calls this method. The reason I added that incrementing integer is just to be able to show the multiple invocations of the method. So I can cause the client page to invoke this method multiple times, and you get some visual feedback that it is actually making multiple calls to the Hello World service. All right, then the doginfoQS method returns a string that contains HTML markup and content that the page reads from HTML files. This is a way to deliver down to the client page a complete chunk of HTML. Now there's lots of different ways of doing this. I could have built some sort of HTML string in code, but it made it easy and convenient to put it in separate HTML files. And in this case, it's retrieving information about different dogs. So as you can see, it just opens up the file, reads the text, and then returns the contents as a string. The doginfoparam is a variation of that previous method. It returns the same response as the doginfoQS, but receives a parameter with the dog's name in order to select the content to return. This version up here uses a query string, and so it starts out by retrieving the query string value. But this retrieves the same information, the dog's name that we want to retrieve the information about, and receives it as a parameter. All right, then the rest of the code within the web service is a little bit more complex. This getAllBurrows method is going to return a burrows object. The burrows object is a generic list of type burrow. So this is going to contain information about a few of the larger boroughs within Alaska. We have boroughs, not counties, within the state. And so it's going to have the name, population, and the date that it was created. Actually, the year that it was created, the borough was created. And then When I instantiate this burrows object, I initialize several objects with the name, the population, and the year that the burrow was created. And so I'm going to be able to show you how you can return a .NET object and use the jQuery AJAX features in order to change that into a data structure that the client-side page can use. Now, in a real application, most of these services would probably connect to a database to retrieve data for the client. Maybe not the ones that retrieve the HTML files, but the other ones. But in order to keep things simple, including the setup for the samples for this course so you can easily run these applications, and because our focus here isn't on building web services, all of the samples return relatively static results. They provide data and updated content to the client page to show how AJAX and jQuery works, but the services don't themselves do any real work. All right, enough about the web services. Let's get started and explore the AJAX features in jQuery. One of the most commonly used and easy ways to use AJAX, using jQuery or otherwise, is to retrieve content from the web server and insert it directly into an element on the page. The new content could be a chunk of HTML markup, big, small, whatever, but it can consist of markup and text that becomes new child content of the target container element. Or it could consist of just plain old text that becomes the new text content of the target. This sort of operation is extremely easy using the jQuery load method, which makes using AJAX just about as easy as it gets. There's an excellent chance that this will become the technique you use most often to use AJAX to update the content of a page. So let's talk about this very special method. The load method loads content from the web server and directly updates all elements in the match set with that refreshed content. It has a rather simple syntax that I show here, but it's surprisingly flexible despite its simplicity. The URL argument identifies the resource on the web server that you want to access, which, as you'll see shortly, can be a web service, server file, or other content sources. The data argument is the set of arguments sent with the request, and it can be a string, object, or an array. Then finally, the complete argument, the third and final argument of the load method, is a callback function to which jQuery will pass the response, status information, and a reference to the XHR object. The XHR object is the object that allows the client-side browser to make a web service call. It handles all of the calls from the client to the server. Now, you won't need to use it very often, but with a reference to the XHR object, you can get additional information about the AJAX call that was just completed. Now, the form of the data argument will determine how the call is made to the server. If the argument is an object or an array, then the load method will use the HTTP post method. If the argument is a string, it'll use the get method. And you can also include query string parameters as part of the URL to use the get method. So in the upcoming examples, I'm going to show you several different ways to use this load method. Now, one bit of warning. AJAX requests are generally limited by the browser to the same web server from which the browser loaded the page, and in which the jQuery code is executing. That works fine for the sample application because, as you saw, the web services are within the same project, located even within the same folder as the HTML pages. But this is called the same origin policy. This is a critical security feature that prevents various kinds of attacks on a site. Script code has relatively unfettered access to code in different pages and code files on the same domain, but the browser prevents accessing code from other domains. So just be aware of that if you try to do any kind of cross-domain web service calls. It can get you in trouble. There are ways of doing it, but you have to set things up in very specific sorts of ways. All right, in order to jump into some of the samples, first thing we're going to look at is getting content from HTML files. And this is probably the easiest way to use the load method, because what you're going to do is insert the contents of another HTML page into the current page. You'll rarely use this technique to load the entire contents of another page, although you certainly can. More often, you use this technique to load HTML fragments from an HTML file on the server, and that's what this sample is going to do. So let's take a look at it. Here's the first sample page that I want to show you. I'll go ahead and run it in Firefox so you can see what it does. Now initially, when the page loads, it just includes a header and links to 3 dogs' names, Casper, Pippi, and Jewel. When I click on any of those links, it goes out to the server using jQuery AJAX features and reads the contents of several different HTML files. It goes out to the server and retrieves the content of one of several HTML files. Here's the information about Casper, and this is the HTML that is now embedded within the page as a result of that AJAX call. As you can see, it includes a picture. I can click on Pippi. We can see some information about Pippi. And Jewel, who's my little girl. And notice, as I click these different links, I'm not getting a page refresh. This is all happening by client-side AJAX. All right, so let me close that. And first, let me show you the file for the dogs. Here I have the dog files in their own folder. And here's the file for Jewel. So as you can see, it's just a fragment of HTML code. It doesn't have an HTML header or body or any of those other tags. It just has the HTML that I want to insert into the page. And as you can see, Visual Studio doesn't particularly like this because it's trying to validate this HTML, but I don't care about that because this is just an HTML fragment that I'm going to insert into the page. So it's going to be this content that I'm going to get back from that web service that reads the HTML files. All right, let's go back over to load content. And here's the entire body of the page when it originally loads. I have that header. I have the div with the different links. Okay, so it just has 3 different links that point directly to those files. And then I have the div element that is going to be updated with the contents of those files. Now what's a little bit interesting here is that I have an actual href. And absent any code here, that would display that fragment page as the complete contents of the page within the browser. By doing this, if somebody has JavaScript turned off, the page will degrade gracefully. Actually, this really is progressive enhancement. But anyway, if this JavaScript doesn't execute, then this link is still active, and the person will at least get the dog information, even though it won't be all that pretty because it doesn't have a link to the style sheet. So in fact, I can go ahead and view it again. I'll view that in Firefox. I'll turn off scripting, and I'll reload the page just for good measure, and click on the Jewel link, and now I'm seeing just the contents of that jewel.html. So the page actually degrades rather nicely when JavaScript is turned off. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back on and shut that down. And finally, here's the code that uses the load method to make that AJAX call. It's contained within the jQuery ready method, and it's going to grab a reference to all of the anchor tags that are available within the page, and specifically that are contained within this div element. And then it's going to define the click event function for each of those anchor tags. So when the user clicks on any of those links, it's not going to immediately redirect to this page. Instead, it's going to make an AJAX call using the load method and passing to the load method the attribute, the value of the href attribute for the clicked link. So let me say that again a little bit differently. It's going to pass as the parameter to the load method the value of this href attribute. And this, of course, refers to the element on the page that caused this click event function to fire. So that's going to be whichever link the user clicked on. And so what's happening here is the load method is explicitly requesting a particular file from the server, and then it's going to read that information and directly insert it into the match set that I have here, which references this div element. And then finally, the function returns false, because if you don't do this, then the page will go on and continue to redirect to this file. But by passing false, it will turn off or short circuit that normal behavior of clicking a link within the browser. All right, so when this code runs, the dog's HTML fragment loads into the div, and the user can admire the selected dog. So let me run the page one more time. And I'll start up Firebug so you can see what's happening to the body of the page. So here's where I first load the page, and you can see that I have the links and I have just empty div content. Then when I click on a link, such as Pippi, it updates this div content, and now I can see that that HTML is literally inserted as the contents of that div element. All right, so that loads the entire file into that div element. But what if you only want a portion of the content that's retrieved from that HTML file? The load method can handle that too, letting you pass a jQuery selector as part of the URL argument. jQuery then extracts the snippet of HTML that matches the selector and uses that to update the page instead of the entire HTML content retrieved from the server. Now this is a useful technique, but it's really important to understand that when you use a selector as part of the URL, the server is going to deliver the entire set of HTML to the client browser, and then, only then, does jQuery on the client extract the snippet of content that you want to use in the page. So it's really not a good idea to use this technique with a huge chunk of HTML when the client is only going to need a small portion. Nevertheless, it can be a very useful technique. All right, so let me shut this down and go back over. And first of all, show you a different form of the dogs file. I've got this all.html. And what this is I took all of those individual HTML files and put them in one big file and wrapped each dog's information in a div tag with an ID value of the dog's name. So the new client page is going to download all of this HTML. Obviously, it's not a huge chunk, so it's not going to be a huge drain on bandwidth. But it's going to download all of this HTML, and then the client will extract the information for Casper or Pippi or Jewel based on whichever link the user selected. And then I have a variation on the page, load content all, that uses that file instead. Now the body section of this page is a little bit different from the previous sample page because the href attributes no longer have any dog-specific HTML files to reference. Now I could still reference the individual dog files, but then I'd have duplicated content on the server, which complicates site maintenance. Instead, the code in this page is going to use the text content of each anchor element, the dog's name, in order to retrieve that dog's content from all.html. Okay, so otherwise, the content of the body of this page is the same as the previous sample. And here's the modified click event function. The only difference here is that rather than just passing the name of the file, requesting a file from the server, I'm still doing that, except I'm referencing that single file that has all the dog information, but I'm also passing this selector. It's a div, pound, and what ends up being the dog's name. So it's using the text function to read the content of that link. So the result here is going to be div, pound, Casper or Pippi or whatever it is. And jQuery knows what to do with that. So I'm going to get the contents of the all file, and then the load method is going to retrieve the div that is named after a particular dog. And then it once again returns false. So if I run this version of the page, I can view it in the browser. Same appearance, And we have the same result. Now there is one other slight variation. If I look at the contents of this page, and here's the div content, notice that I'm getting that div element as well, because that's included within that selector. I could easily rearrange that if I really didn't want that div element with the dog's name in there. I could use a slightly different selector in order to do that. Here it doesn't make any difference, so I included it. Now one downside of this version of the page is that users without JavaScript enabled will be able to click on the link and literally nothing is going to happen. They don't get the dog's content at all. You'll have to provide another mechanism to deal with that situation. And you want to do that if only to put up a notice that the page requires JavaScript. Now alternatively, you could restore the href values to the individual dog pages and return false in the loadContent.html. But again, that requires you to have duplicate content because you would have to have that all.html as well as the individual dog files. I suppose alternatively, you could just display the contents of all.html, but then the user is not getting the information about the specific dog that they selected. You're not limited to using static HTML files using this form of the load method. The URL argument that you use with the method could specify a dynamic file as well, such as an ASP.NET ASPX file, a PHP file, or any other dynamic technology supported on the web server. In this case, the dynamic page on the web server could hit a database or other resource and create the HTML fragment on the fly, which gives you enormous flexibility in generating content without the need to create separate HTML files for every bit of content that might be needed to update the page. But most often, you're probably going to load content by calling a web service, and that's what we'll look at doing next. Using AJAX to call a web service on the server is one of the best ways to dynamically update part of a web page using AJAX. You can request only the data you need, and you can do anything you want in the web service to retrieve data. You can read files, hit a database, call other web services, format the server's hard drive, although I don't really recommend that one. But you can do anything you want. Anything you can do in .NET code on the server, go for it. Best of all, AJAX and jQuery can handle several different data formats. So you usually won't have to write any client-side JavaScript code in order to parse the response before using it. There really is not all that much different when using the load method to retrieve data from a web service rather than static HTML files. This hello-world.html sample page uses the Hello World web service in AJAX services in order to retrieve a string, which the page then uses to update the content of 3 div elements on the page. So I'll go ahead and run it so you can see what it does. All right, there's the initial load of the page, and I can click on the button, and it displays Hello World number 1, 3 different ways. And I can click it a few more times, and now you can see why I implemented that Hello World web service to provide an incremented number with each invocation. So you can see that I'm actually making a call to the server multiple times. Now, there's one thing you need to know about working with this kind of application within Visual Studio. In this particular case, I was able to right-click on the web page within Visual Studio and view in the browser. And as you can see, if I come down here and look at the hidden icons, the ASP.NET development server is running. And so that enables that web service to run, and I can call it, and it increments and returns the information back to me. But you have to make sure that that web service can run. So a lot of times you'll want to start the project by either pressing F5 or selecting Debug and Start Debugging from Visual Studio in order to make sure that it's running. Now, one other thing about this is that if you run the Hello World page from within Visual Studio, then close the page to stop execution, then the Hello World web service will retain the previous numeric value. If you want to start over, you need to stop the ASP.NET development server using that icon that I just showed you down in the toolbox. Usually this resets the value, but sometimes Visual Studio will stubbornly retain the value. Just be aware of those kind of anomalies of debugging with Visual Studio. All right, I'll leave that running and go back over, and just to remind you, here's the hello world web service method, and it uses this count variable, increments it each time, and then returns that string. Just about as simple a web service as you can possibly get. All right, back over to the hello world page. Here's the body of the page. As you can see, it's fairly simple, just an H1 and a button. And then I have these 3 div tags, and that's why the content appeared 3 times. I really just wanted to use that to show you that the load method is going to update the content of all of the elements within the match set that you call it upon. So it's going to update all 3 of these div elements because I'm grabbing a reference to all of the divs on that page. And the first div had a larger font because I have this style defined within the page. It's specific only to the div says 1, this one right there, and it increases the font size to 24 points. All right, so nothing all that magical here other than the load method is going to update multiple elements. All right, so here's the code that wires up that click event function for that button says, and it uses the load method and passes in the name of that web service and the method that I want to execute. In this case, the web method doesn't need any additional information, no parameters, so that's all I need to pass to the load method. It goes out, invokes that web service method, that returns that string with the incrementing number, and the load method automatically updates the contents of all of the div elements on the page. So it's really pretty simple. Now, of course, you're not limited to calling web services without arguments. And the load method provides several different ways to provide information to the web service that it's calling. So I have another version of this page that's called load content WS. So this page, once again, retrieves that HTML content for each of the dogs. I'll go ahead and view this one in the browser. And there you can see we have several different sets of links that do different things. Essentially pass the information to the server, or to the web service method, in different ways. But overall, the page does the exact same stuff. Now I have this form. I'm going to show you why that's happening. But for the most part, the links do the same sort of thing as I've shown you in several examples here. All right, so let's go back over to the code. And the way the page is set up is that I have this div that is going to receive the updated content. And then I have 5 sets of links. And they're all contained within different div elements. They're named div dog links 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I can use that pattern to simplify the code that wires up the click event procedure for these links. But basically, the redundancy there makes it easy to use a selector to write event code associated with each of those links. And notice, too, that I once again have the href value set to a £, because I don't need any kind of specific URL within there or a reference to a particular file, because I'm using a web service method. All right, so here's the code. Several different sections. The one thing I want to observe right now is that they're all contained within their own jQuery ready method. This is not a requirement. I could have defined all of these click event procedures within a single ready, but it just makes more sense to me to put them within their own ready method. You can do it however you want. All right, so let's start looking at how we can pass information to the web service. And the first example here is going to pass the data, the dog's name, as a query string parameter that is part of the URL. So here I have this web service and the web service method, and then I have this query string parameter, and I'm just concatenating onto it the name of the dog that I want to request. All right, so this is using the doginfo_qs web service. So I'll come back over here just to remind you that this is the form that reads the query string parameter using the request object there, and then reads the contents of the HTML from one of those files within the dogs folder. Okay, so same sort of thing that we've seen. I do want to point out that if there's no parameter passed, if there's nothing for the dog, then it just returns the empty string, and that div element on the page is simply cleared out. All right, so I'll come back over here, and that load method gets the contents of that HTML files, and it updates that div element directly. But there's a small problem with retrieving HTML using a web service like this. The XHR object in most browsers encodes the HTML as a safety measure, which really is a good thing. But it makes it a bit harder to retrieve HTML using this technique. So that's where the second set of links on the page show the problem. So when I click the second set, notice that I'm not getting HTML, new HTML on the page, but I'm getting encoded HTML. If I look at the source behind the page using Firebug, there I can clearly see the encoded HTML markup. Clearly not what we want. We want this effect. So let me go back over to the source here. So in order to deal with that, and to show the formatted content rather than the HTML elements on the page, I need to decode the HTML before I update that div element. So in order to do that, this form of the load method defines a function object as the third parameter in order to provide a callback function. And what this is going to do is the load method is going to update that div content. The callback function reads that updated content using the text method and then turns around and uses the HTML method in order to update the content once again. And this has the effect of decoding that HTML, and now that updated content within that div element, the div content element, now displays regular HTML as I intend. So that's a pretty nifty jQuery trick. Just uses the text method to retrieve the contents, and then writes it back to the same element using the HTML method. The second set of links do not include that callback function here. And so that's why we're seeing the encoded HTML. Another way to pass an argument to a web service method is by passing it as the second argument to the load method. And this is the technique that I used in the third set of links on the page. Come back over here. You can see that this actually works. All right, here's that code. This time, the URL argument simply has the link to the web service and the web method. There isn't anything else concatenated onto it. And the second argument creates what looks like a query string argument to pass as the parameter. Now, it doesn't include the question mark that separates query strings from the main part of the URL. But if you had additional parameters that you needed to pass, you could concatenate them together using the ampersand, same ampersand that you could use to concatenate query string parameters together. And this is just one form of how you can pass an argument to a web service method. The nice thing about either way you pass the arguments that you've seen so far, whether you include them in the URL or in the second argument to the load method, the cool thing is that jQuery just figures out what needs to be done to properly make the call to the web service. It's just yet another way that jQuery makes coding simpler. All right, but there's yet more ways. Another option is to pass any parameters as an object literal. Once again, jQuery is going to do the right thing with any arguments that you pass, and it retrieves the dog's selected information based on this parameter that you send. Essentially becomes a name-value pair. Name being the variable name and the value being the dog's name. If you wanted to, you could pass multiple parameters by including comma-delimited parameters within this object literal. Another option is to pass the parameter, but this time use a different form of the web service method that actually takes a parameter rather than reading the query string. So if we go back over to the web service method here, up to now we've been using this method that uses a request object to get the value of that parameter. But now we're going to call this web method, which takes a direct parameter to this method. I no longer have to read the value using the request object because I'm getting it as part of the method call. Otherwise, the rest of that method is identical to the previous version of the method. All right. This code, other than calling a different method, passes the parameter as an object literal and does all the exact same stuff in order to decode the HTML.